Have you ever noticed that some people seem to be rooting for you, right up until the moment you started succeeding? People who said they believed in your potential, but then became strangely quiet when you achieved something important. People who stood by your side when you doubted yourself, but began showing signs of discomfort when you started believing in your own abilities. What if I told you that most of the time, this doesn't happen because of your success itself, but because of what your success awakens within them? There is a psychological truth that very few people understand. Most people assume that anyone who doesn't want to see you grow is simply jealous. But Carl Jung saw something much deeper. To him, the greatest human conflicts rarely occur on the surface. They take place in the hidden regions of the mind, in repressed desires, unacknowledged frustrations, and aspects of the personality that remain concealed even from the people who carry them. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. Maybe you started a new project, changed your habits, developed more discipline, or finally took an important step toward your goals. And instead of receiving support, you encountered resistance, discouraging comments, criticism disguised as concern, jokes that seemed harmless but carried something unsettling beneath the surface, as if your growth was creating a silent discomfort in some of the people around you. What's even more interesting is that, in many cases, these people don't even realize what's happening inside them. They believe they're just being realistic. They believe they're trying to help. They believe they're pointing out risks or offering advice. But deep down, something far more profound is at play. Because when someone chooses to grow, change, and awaken to their own potential, they become a mirror. And mirrors have a powerful effect. They reveal what many people have spent their entire lives trying not to see. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. It sounds simple, but it contains one of the most important keys to understanding why some people feel so uncomfortable with someone else's success. After all, why would another person's achievement provoke so much resistance? Why does one person's growth inspire admiration in some and resentment in others? Why do certain people celebrate your progress, while others seem to silently hope that you stay exactly where you've always been? The answer isn't just jealousy. It isn't just competition, and it isn't simply about external circumstances. It lies in something much deeper, something Jung devoted much of his life to understanding, something that exists within all of us and has the power to completely transform the way you interpret your relationships, your achievements, and even the reactions of the people around you. Because the real reason some people don't want you to succeed may not be what you think. And once you understand this psychological mechanism, you'll begin to see situations in your own life from an entirely different perspective. Before we continue, I want to ask you a very sincere question. As you listen to this reflection, did someone immediately come to mind? Someone who seemed comfortable with your presence as long as you stayed where you were, but whose behavior changed once you started growing, evolving, or believing in yourself more? If so, you're not alone. And perhaps this video will explain more than you realize about experiences that many people go through, but rarely know how to put into words. If this topic is already sparking reflection within you, take a moment to leave a like. It may seem like a simple gesture, but every like helps this message reach other people who are also trying to understand why some relationships change when success starts to appear. The algorithm doesn't always promote content about self-discovery, depth psychology, and personal growth on its own. When you engage, you help this conversation reach someone who may be going through the exact same situation right now. And I'd love for you to take part in this reflection. Write the phrase, "I felt this," in the comments. Or if you prefer, share an experience that left a lasting impression on you. Maybe it was a friend who drifted away, a family member who started criticizing your choices, or someone who seemed to support your dreams until they actually began coming true. Often, when we put these experiences into words, we realize they are part of something much bigger than we ever imagined. And if you enjoy content about Carl Jung, analytical psychology, self-discovery, awakening consciousness, human behavior, personal development, and the hidden mechanisms that influence our relationships. Subscribe to the channel now. Because here, we don't just analyze what happens around us. We explore what happens within the human mind, the invisible regions that shape emotions, choices, and destinies, because what you're about to discover in the next few minutes could completely change the way you interpret people's reactions to your achievements. More importantly, it may help you understand why some people seem bothered precisely when you begin becoming the person you were meant to be. Now, there is something most people never realize about this subject, something that explains why some people genuinely celebrate your growth, while others respond with discomfort, criticism, or even an odd silence. And the explanation isn't where most people look. In fact, it begins in a much deeper part of the human psyche, a place that Carl Jung believed was responsible for many of the invisible conflicts we carry throughout life. There is something fascinating that happens when a person truly begins to change. Not when they merely talk about change, not when they post motivational quotes on social media, but when they genuinely start transforming their life, when they begin developing self-awareness, when they cultivate discipline, when they stop tolerating certain situations, when they stop constantly doubting themselves. That is when some relationships begin revealing a side that had previously remained hidden. Perhaps you've experienced this without fully realizing it. For years, certain people seemed completely comfortable around you. Conversations flowed naturally. The relationship felt balanced. There was support, closeness, and even affection. But then something changed, not necessarily in them. In you, maybe you started believing more in your potential. Maybe you launched a new project. Maybe you decided to take better care of yourself. Maybe you began a personal growth journey. Maybe you awakened to a more conscious version of your own identity. And suddenly some people began acting differently. The compliments became less frequent. The criticism increased. Doubts about your plans started appearing. Encouragement was replaced by constant warnings. What once felt like support began carrying a strange tone that was difficult to explain. And here's an important question. Why would someone be bothered by your growth? The answer seems simple. Many people immediately say, jealousy. But if there is one thing Carl Jung taught us, it's that human behavior rarely has such superficial explanations. Most of the time, what we see is only the tip of the iceberg. Something deeper is happening within the psyche, something that is not always conscious. Because the truth is that your growth doesn't affect only you. It affects how other people see themselves. Think about that for a moment. Imagine two people walking side by side for years. Both have dreams, both have potential, both have desires they never fulfilled. But one of them decides to act, decides to face their fears, decides to take risks, decides to step outside their comfort zone, decides to grow. At that moment, the very existence of that transformation begins sending a silent message to the person who remains stuck. A message that requires no words. A message that says, it was possible. And that is one of the most uncomfortable messages a human being can receive, because as long as we believe we had no choice, we feel a certain sense of relief. As long as we believe our limitations came solely from circumstances, we preserve our narrative. But when we see someone close to us achieve what we once claimed was impossible, something inside us begins to shift, Carl Jung observed. That whatever triggers us emotionally almost always points toward inner content we do not yet fully understand. That's why some people feel inspired by another person's success and others feel threatened by it. Not because success is an attack, but because it functions as a mirror. And mirrors have an uncomfortable characteristic. They show what stands before. Then perhaps that's exactly why some people seem to love your company while you were insecure, while you doubted yourself, while you stayed small, while you posed no threat to the emotional structures around you. But when you started growing, something changed without realizing it. You stopped validating certain narratives. You stopped reinforcing certain excuses. You stopped playing the role some people expected you to keep playing, and that creates tension because many relationships are not built solely on affection. They are also built on invisible expectations, on unspoken roles, on emotional agreements that were never verbalized. Maybe they expected you to always be the one who needed help. Maybe they expected you to always be the one who was afraid. Maybe they expected you to always be the one seeking approval. Maybe they expected you to remain exactly where you were. And when you begin to change, those invisible agreements start to break apart. What's most interesting is that in many cases, no one consciously realizes what is happening. A person doesn't wake up thinking, "Today I'm going to be bothered by his success." It doesn't work that way. The discomfort appears. Subtly, it shows up as criticism. It shows up as sarcasm. It shows up as indifference. It shows up as distance. It shows up as that strange energy you can feel but can't quite explain. And perhaps you spent years trying to understand what you did wrong. Maybe you thought you were overreacting, that you were imagining things, that you were being too sensitive. But what if the truth is something else? What if the problem isn't that you changed? What if it's precisely that you've started becoming who you truly are? Jung believed that one of life's most important tasks is the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you were born to be. But there is something almost no one mentions about that journey. It doesn't just transform you, it transforms all of your relationships, because the closer you get to your truth, the more visible the difference becomes between those who celebrate your growth and those who feel threatened by it. And there is an even deeper psychological reason for this, a reason that goes far beyond jealousy, competition, or comparison, a reason that explains why some people seem to react emotionally to the simple fact that you are growing, even when you have never done anything against them. And to understand this mechanism, we need to talk about something Carl Jung considered one of the most powerful and least understood forces of the human mind. If this reflection awakened something within you, write the phrase, "I am becoming who I am," in the comments. Sometimes transformation begins the moment we recognize that our growth may reveal far more about others than we ever imagined. Perhaps at this point, you still think all of this comes down to jealousy. After all, that's the explanation we hear most often when someone shows discomfort in response to another person's success. But here's something that may completely change the way you interpret this phenomenon. Most of the time, it's not jealousy in the way you imagine. And that is precisely the part that very few people are able to see, because when we think of jealousy, we usually picture someone looking at your life and wishing they had what you have. We imagine a resentful person who is fully aware of their discomfort, internally acknowledging that they would like to be in your position. But human behavior is rarely that simple. Carl Jung devoted much of his life to understanding what happens beneath the surface, what people feel without realizing it, what influences behavior without ever becoming fully conscious, and perhaps that's why so many people misinterpret the reactions they receive when they begin to grow. Imagine someone who spent years telling themselves that their dreams were impossible, years repeating that it wasn't the right time, that they lacked resources that they didn't have, opportunities that they weren't talented enough, that life was unfair, that circumstances were responsible for everything. Some of those explanations may contain a degree of truth, but over time they also become a form of psychological protection, because there is something incredibly painful about admitting that maybe you could have tried harder, that maybe you could have believed in yourself more, that maybe you abandoned important parts of your identity. And this is exactly where your growth becomes uncomfortable for some people, not because they necessarily want what you have, but because your growth threatens a narrative they built in order to survive emotionally. Think about that for a few seconds. When you see someone achieve something you never wanted, you rarely feel any discomfort, But when you see someone accomplish something you once dreamed of achieving yourself, the experience is completely different because that person becomes a living possibility, and possibilities can be deeply unsettling. They ask silent questions, questions no one wants to hear. If he did it, what stopped me? If she changed, why did I stay the same? If it was possible for her, could it have been possible for me too? These questions rarely emerge consciously. Most of the time, they appear as emotions that are difficult to explain, a strange irritation, automatic, criticism, a need to find flaws, a desire to diminish what should inspire, and perhaps you've witnessed this yourself. Maybe someone said you just got lucky. Maybe they minimized your effort. Maybe they suggested you had changed for the worse. Maybe they made seemingly innocent comments loaded with an energy you couldn't quite understand. What's fascinating is that in many cases, these people are not deliberately trying to hurt you. They are trying to protect the image they have of themselves, an image built over many years, an identity founded on justifications, beliefs, and internal stories. And when your success enters the picture, that structure begins to shake. Carl Jung observed that human beings have a deep need for psychological coherence. We need to believe that our worldview makes sense. We need to believe that our choices were justified. We need to believe that life unfolded in the only way it could have. But when someone close to us breaks through limits that we ourselves accepted as final, that sense of coherence begins to be questioned, and that creates discomfort, a great deal of discomfort. Perhaps that's exactly why some people seemed perfectly comfortable while you remained small, while you talked about your dreams but never acted on them, while you wanted change but continued staying in the same place, while you still had potential but had not yet become living proof that transformation was possible. But when you started taking action, something changed. When you developed self-awareness, when you began your personal growth journey, when you started believing more in your own abilities, when you stopped asking for permission to grow, when you began your process of awakening consciousness, you stopped being just a person, you became a reminder, a constant reminder of choices, of possibilities, of roads not taken, of abandoned versions of oneself. And that is exactly why the explanation cannot be reduced to jealousy, because something much deeper is happening, something related not to what you achieved, but to what your transformation awakens within another person, something Carl Jung considered one of the most powerful forces of the human psyche, a force that operates silently, shapes perceptions, influences emotions, and causes completely different people to react in surprisingly similar ways to someone else's success. And to understand this mechanism, we need to explore one of the most fascinating concepts in analytical psychology, a concept that explains why some people feel inspired by your growth, while others seem threatened by it without even understanding why. If this reflection has helped you see certain situations in your life differently, write the phrase "success reveals" in the comments. Sometimes what appears to be a reaction to our growth is actually a reflection of something much deeper happening within other people. There is a concept within Carl Jung's psychology that explains something that, at first glance, seems contradictory. Why do some people feel inspired when they see someone else grow, while others seem deeply bothered by it? Why does one person's success awaken admiration in some and resistance in others? The answer lies in a psychological mechanism that is as powerful as it is invisible, a mechanism that operates quietly within the human mind and that Jung called projection. Perhaps you've experienced something like this before. You share an achievement that took years to build, something that required effort, discipline, self-awareness, personal growth, and countless internal battles. You assume the people close to you will be happy. After all, they know your journey. They know your struggles. They know the moments when you almost gave up. But instead of enthusiasm, you notice something strange. The smile feels forced, the response feels cold, the subject changes quickly, or worse, the person finds some detail to diminish what you've accomplished, and in that moment, A difficult question becomes impossible to ignore. Why? Carl Jung believed that what we fail to recognize within ourselves tends to appear projected onto others. In other words, unconscious contents that we cannot see within ourselves end up being perceived outside of us. And this completely changes the way we understand human relationships, because very often the discomfort someone feels in response to your success has little to do with you directly. It has to do with what you awaken. Imagine someone who spent years burying their own dreams, years convincing themselves they were not capable, years avoiding risks, years abandoning deep desires in exchange for security. Those parts do not disappear. According to Jung, nothing that is repressed simply ceases to exist. What is rejected continues living in the hidden regions of the psyche. It continues influencing emotions. It continues shaping behavior. It continues searching for a way to be acknowledged. And then you appear. You begin moving forward. You begin growing. You begin believing in yourself more. You begin pursuing goals that other people abandoned long ago. And without realizing it, you become a mirror, a living mirror, a walking reflection of what they could have been. And mirrors are not always comfortable, because a mirror does not lie. It shows what exists. It shows what has been avoided. It shows what has been left behind. Perhaps that is exactly why some people seem to react so intensely to your growth. Not because they necessarily want to take your place, but because your existence forces something within them to awaken, something that had been asleep, something that had remained hidden, something they spent years trying to ignore. Jung observed that most human conflicts arise from what remains unconscious. And when a person encounters someone who is living out something they themselves have repressed, a disproportionate emotional reaction often emerges. That is why a simple achievement of yours can trigger irritation. That is why a positive change can provoke criticism. That is why your evolution can awaken resistance, because what appears to be a reaction to your success is often a reaction to the other person's own unresolved pain. And perhaps that realization is liberating, because for a long time you may have believed that you needed to convince others, explain your choices, justify your growth, prove your intentions, show that you are still the same person. But there is an important truth that self-awareness reveals. Not every negative reaction is about you. Many of them are about what the other person has not yet been able to confront within themselves. The person who abandoned their dreams may feel uncomfortable around someone who keeps trying. The person who gave up on their own potential may feel threatened by someone who is developing theirs. The person who built an identity around complacency may feel unsettled when observing someone in transformation. And the most fascinating part is that quite often they do not understand this themselves. They believe they are reacting to you, but in reality they are reacting to the reflection they see in you. This is one of the reasons Carl Jung considered self-awareness so important. Because without awareness, people confuse projection with reality. They confuse internal emotions with external facts. They confuse their own wounds with flaws in others. And when that happens, they become incapable of recognizing what is truly causing their discomfort. Perhaps someone is coming to mind right now. Someone who seemed supportive until the moment you started growing. Someone who enjoyed your company while you remained insecure. Someone who felt comfortable with your dreams as long as they were only ideas, but who changed once those dreams began becoming reality. If that happened, there is a chance that you became something far more powerful than you realize. Not just a successful person, but a symbol, a living reminder of possibility. And this is exactly where we enter one of Carl Jung's deepest discoveries. Because there is something even more unsettling than serving as a mirror for someone's abandoned dreams. There is a part of the human psyche that reacts especially intensely when it sees another person expressing qualities that it has suppressed throughout life. An invisible force that can transform admiration into resentment, inspiration into resistance, and closeness into distance without anyone consciously understanding why. If this reflection has made you realize that some reactions to your growth may not have been about you, but about what you awaken in others, write the phrase, "I am a mirror," in the comments. Sometimes understanding this completely changes the way we interpret certain relationships. There is one detail that very few people notice when they begin their journey of self-awareness and personal growth. At some point, without planning it, you stop fighting to be accepted by everyone. And that is precisely when some relationships begin to change. Not because you became arrogant, not because you grew cold, not because you stopped caring about people, but because something quiet happened within you, something Carl Jung considered one of the most important milestones of psychological awakening. You began building your identity from within rather than from external approval. Think for a moment about how many decisions a person makes throughout life simply to avoid rejection. How many times they silence their opinions, how many times they abandon their dreams, how many times they dim their own light, how many times they pretend to be smaller than they really are. All of it to maintain a sense of belonging, all of it to preserve connections, all of it to avoid the discomfort of being judged. Perhaps you've done this yourself. Perhaps you hid your talents. Perhaps you downplayed your achievements. Perhaps you pretended to be insecure so you wouldn't intimidate anyone. Perhaps you toned down your ambition so you wouldn't seem different. And perhaps you didn't even realize you were doing it, because many of these adaptations happen unconsciously. Jung observed that one of humanity's deepest needs is belonging. We are social beings. We want to be accepted. We want to be part of the group. We want to feel valued. There is nothing wrong with that. The problem arises when the need for acceptance becomes more important than the truth of who we are. Because, at that point, a person begins abandoning authentic parts of their identity. And every abandoned part comes with an invisible cost. A void that is difficult to explain, a constant feeling of living below one's potential, a sense that something within is trying to emerge, yet continues to be suppressed. Perhaps that is exactly why so many people feel afraid when they begin to grow. Because growth does not only challenge external limits, it challenges emotional bonds, it challenges expectations, it challenges the silent agreements that existed within certain relationships, agreements that were never spoken aloud, but were always there. You stay small, I stay comfortable. You keep doubting yourself. I never have to question my own choices. You keep seeking approval. I continue holding influence. And then something changes. You begin developing awareness. You begin trusting your own perception. You begin listening to your intuition. You begin recognizing patterns. You begin realizing your worth. And without realizing it, you stop participating in those invisible agreements. That is when some people begin to feel uncomfortable, not because you are attacking anyone, but because your transformation changes the emotional balance of the relationship. Imagine someone who always felt superior because you were insecure, or someone who felt needed because you constantly depended on validation, or someone who held influence over you because you were afraid of disappointing others. When you grow internally, those dynamics begin to disappear, and along with them disappears a form of power that certain people once had over you. Perhaps that is exactly what you have noticed in some relationships. The same people who claimed to want the best for you began acting strangely when you truly started to thrive. The same people who encouraged your dreams showed resistance when the results began to appear. The same people who supported your growth became uncomfortable when it stopped being a theory and became reality, because there is a huge difference between supporting an idea and living alongside the real transformation that idea produces. Carl Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, But very few people talk about the psychological cost of that journey, because becoming who you truly are requires letting go of old versions of yourself. It requires abandoning masks. It requires facing fears. It requires enduring misunderstanding. It requires accepting that not everyone will remain comfortable with your growth. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult lessons of self-awareness. Not every loss means you are on the wrong path. Not every criticism means you need to turn back. Not every distance or separation means you have done something wrong. Sometimes people do not pull away because you failed. They pull away because you finally started believing something about yourself that they never believed about themselves. And there is something even deeper happening here, because true power does not emerge when you convince others to accept your growth. True power emerges when you no longer need that permission, when your identity no longer depends on external validation, when your sense of worth no longer rises and falls with every opinion, when your awareness becomes stronger than your desire to please everyone. That is when a silent transformation takes place, a transformation that few people can explain, yet one that completely changes the way you relate to the world. You stop wasting energy trying to prove who you are. You stop justifying your dreams. You stop asking for permission to grow. And you begin living from an inner source of confidence, a confidence that is not born from the ego. It is born from awareness. It is born from self-knowledge. It is born from the integration of who you are and who you are becoming. And this is precisely where we arrive at the most important point of this entire reflection. Because there is an even deeper reason why some people do not want your success, a reason that goes beyond jealousy, beyond projection, and beyond emotional discomfort. A reason that reveals something powerful about human nature and about what happens when someone finally awakens to their own potential. If this reflection resonated with you, write the phrase, "I don't need permission to grow," in the comments. Sometimes recognizing that is the first step toward reclaiming parts of your identity that have been hidden for far too long. And now we arrive at the point that very few people are able to see. The point where the question stops being, "Why don't some people want me to succeed?" and becomes something much deeper, something Carl Jung would likely consider the most transformative question of all. What exactly does your success awaken within other people and within yourself? Because there is a tremendous difference between achieving something and understanding the psychological meaning of what you have achieved. Many people spend their lives believing that success is merely an external goal. More money, more recognition, more influence, more accomplishments, more achievements. But from the perspective of analytical psychology, true success has a much deeper dimension. It represents expansion. It represents transformation. It represents the manifestation of potential that remained dormant for years. And that is exactly why it provokes such intense reactions. Because every time someone begins expressing their potential authentically, something invisible happens around them. People begin seeing possibilities that were previously hidden, and possibilities are dangerous. Not because they hurt anyone, but because they force consciousness to awaken. Think about how many times you have heard someone say they would rather not think about a certain issue, that they would rather leave things as they are, that they would rather not stir up certain matters. There is a reason for that. Awareness demands responsibility. The more you see, the harder it becomes to pretend you never saw it. The more you awaken, the harder it becomes to return to your previous state. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Perhaps that is one of the most important statements for understanding everything we have been discussing, because when someone sees you moving forward, growing, and developing self-awareness, they do not see only the results. They see evidence that transformation is possible, and that evidence can be deeply uncomfortable. especially for someone who has spent years convincing themselves that there was no alternative. Perhaps that is exactly why some people try to discredit your goals, not because your goals are impossible, but because your success threatens beliefs they use to explain their own lives. Have you ever noticed how some people seem more interested in proving that something will not work than in discovering whether it could? How some people search for flaws before even considering possibilities? How some people react with automatic skepticism whenever someone tries to break old patterns? Most of the time, this does not happen because they have better information. It happens because protecting an old belief requires less energy than rebuilding an entire identity. And here is the true turning point of this story. Perhaps the biggest mistake is believing that the problem exists only in other people, because there is an even more important question. How many times have you doubted yourself? How many times have you diminished your dreams? How many times have you listened to your own inner voice telling you that you were not capable? How many times have you sabotaged opportunities before even trying? How many times have you allowed fear to take the place of awareness? Because the mechanism we are observing in others can also exist within us. There is a part of the human mind that fears transformation, a part that prefers what is familiar, a part that seeks security, a part that resists growth. And perhaps the greatest psychological awakening does not happen when you identify who does not want your success. Perhaps it happens when you identify the part of yourself that still resists your own potential. That is an uncomfortable reflection, but also an incredibly liberating one, because as long as you believe your battle exists only outside of you, you continue giving power to circumstances. You continue believing that you need to change other people, convince them, receive their approval, earn their acceptance. But when awareness matures, something changes. You realize that not everyone will understand your journey, not everyone will celebrate your growth, not everyone will support your transformation, and that is okay, because the goal was never to be understood by everyone. The goal has always been to become who you truly are. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the path through which a person stops living solely according to external expectations and begins building an authentic relationship with their own essence. And perhaps that is exactly what is happening to you. Perhaps the difficulties you have encountered are not signs that you are on the wrong path. Perhaps they are evidence that you are leaving behind old versions of yourself. Perhaps the discomfort some people display is not an indicator of failure. Perhaps it is a reflection of a transformation they themselves have not yet been able to experience. And then one final question emerges, a question that may completely change the way you interpret your life from this point forward. If your success creates so much discomfort in some people because it represents a possibility they abandoned, what would happen if you finally stopped asking for permission to become everything you are capable of being? Because perhaps the issue was never about who does not want your success. Perhaps the real question is, are you willing to sustain your own growth even when it makes other people uncomfortable? If this reflection spoke to you, write the phrase, "I choose my potential," in the comments. Sometimes, a single conscious decision marks the beginning of a transformation that changes an entire life. If you've made it this far, there's a good chance this message has awakened something within you. Perhaps it reminded you of situations you could never fully explain. Perhaps you recognized people who seemed uncomfortable with your growth. Perhaps you realized that some of the greatest resistance you encountered appeared precisely when you started believing in yourself more. Or perhaps the most important discovery was something else. Understanding that other people's discomfort is not always a sign that you are on the wrong path. Often it is simply the natural consequence of someone deciding to stop hiding and start developing their true potential. Carl Jung believed that one of life's most important tasks is becoming who you truly are. And that journey rarely happens without challenges. It requires awareness, it requires courage, it requires self-knowledge. And above all, it requires the willingness to keep moving forward, even when not everyone understands your transformation. If any part of this video made you think, "This is exactly what I'm going through," then this channel was made for people like you. People who want to understand human psychology on a deeper level. People interested in the teachings of Carl Jung. People seeking awakening, personal growth, self-awareness, and emotional freedom. So subscribe to the channel now, because the upcoming videos will help you recognize patterns that most people never notice, understand invisible psychological mechanisms, and develop a level of awareness capable of transforming the way you understand yourself and the people around you. And now, I want to hear from you. Does this message reflect something you feel or have experienced? Have you ever noticed someone change when you started growing, evolving, or believing in yourself more? Write this phrase in the comments: "I will not dim my light," or share the experience that impacted you the most while watching this video. Often when we put something into words, we begin to understand our own journey much more clearly, and you may discover that many other people are living through experiences similar to yours. If this content brought value to you, leave a like. That simple gesture helps the algorithm bring this message to more people who are trying to understand why certain relationships change when they begin to grow and evolve. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Perhaps there is someone close to you who is questioning their own worth, shrinking their dreams, or believing they must hide who they are in order to be accepted. Sometimes a single reflection can be the beginning of a profound transformation. Now don't stop here. Watch the next video recommended on your screen. Because there is an even deeper aspect of Carl Jung's psychology that explains why some people seem to react emotionally to your presence, even when you have done absolutely nothing against them. Once you understand this mechanism, you will begin to see your relationships, your emotions, and even your own identity from an entirely different perspective. Click on the next video and continue this journey of self-discovery. I'll see you there.